here we go with our first set of video notes in the evolution unit. This one will just be an intro to evolution, talking about the definition of biological evolution, and talk a little bit about how the theory of evolution came about and some of the people who sort of shaped the theory and different ideas of evolution going through time. To begin with, evolution really is just change, right? It's change in things over time. Lots of things change, lots of things evolve. As you can see from my example down here, technology is something you can think of that changes over time, right? You've got, starting out with the really, really old cell phones that you guys have probably never really even seen. In fact, I've never really even seen this guy called the Brick. And phones have gotten smaller and more smart and can do a lot more things, and now we have even more up-to-date pictures than this of phones that can do a whole heck of a lot. They've changed a lot over time, and they've gotten better. Well, some people might argue worse, but overall they've gotten better and more capable over time. They've evolved. They've changed. The only difference between that and what we would call evolution in biological terms is that biological evolution is just a change in a population of organisms over time. And I'm going to underline this part because it's really important. It's the change in a population. Okay? Individual organisms don't evolve. Populations evolve because it's a change in the genotypes, what the genes, the DNA of the population is over time. The idea that organisms have evolved or that have changed has actually been around for a really, really long time. People have been recognizing that different weird organisms are maybe a little bit connected, or that there's a lot of similarities between organisms, and maybe think that they're related somehow. And so this idea is not really new at all. It's way older even than the guy that we're going to talk about here right now, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who's this guy right here. But he was kind of one of the first guys to really popularize it and kind of put some form to it. So anyway, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck was French. You can see he's doing this in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And he had this hypothesis that acquired traits are passed on to your offspring, right? In his definition here, an acquired trait is something that you get in your lifetime. So he kind of figured out that organisms hey, things change, right? And so why do they change? Well, maybe your environment changes you a little bit, and then those changes get passed on to your kids. And so one of his really, really most famous examples are giraffes, who I've pictured down here. And he said, hey, so a long time ago there must have been lots of different giraffes, and they need to eat leaves that are way up high in the trees, like you can see here. And so to reach those leaves that are way up high, the giraffes were constantly stretching their necks, constantly stretching to try to reach those leaves. And by constantly stretching, their necks basically just became longer, and then they would have children or offspring with longer necks. And the problem with this, though, is it doesn't really work that way. Yes, you can acquire traits in your lifetime, right? You could stretch your neck out if you really, really want to. Think of maybe those tribes in Africa where they have their neck stretched out by those golden rings. But the problem with that is you're not changing your DNA, right? Yes, you can stretch your neck, but does that mean that your kid's going to have an extra long neck? No. Right? If you think of it more drastic terms, if you lost your arm in a tragic car accident, does that mean your child's going to be born with just one arm? No. If you get a tattoo, is your kid going to be born with a tattoo? No. So it sort of made sense at the time with their limited knowledge, and if you didn't think of those drastic examples, but really we know now that this is not the way it's working. Yes, things are changing, but they're not changing because of acquired traits being passed on to your offspring, like Lamarck said. The next two scientists that we're going to talk about, or naturalists that we're going to talk about, are Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. One of these guys you probably heard about a lot, and one of these guys you may never have heard about, but they actually had some of the same ideas. Basically, Darwin was traveling around the world, kind of mostly in South America, and then Alfred Russel Wallace traveled a lot in South America, but also worked in the jungles of Malaysia. And basically, independently, these guys came up with the same idea. They basically figured out natural selection totally independent of each other. And they actually both published their work at pretty much the exact same time, but Darwin gets a lot of the credit. You've never really heard anyone talk about the Wallace theory of evolution or natural selection, but you do hear about Darwin's theory of natural selection all the time. There's actually a pretty good reason for that. to get at that reason, we have to talk a little bit more about Darwin. He is obviously the face of evolution, most famous person associated with evolution. And to figure this out, he basically figured this out as he was traveling the world as a ship's naturalist. So he was on this ship called the Beagle, and this is a Navy mission to map South America, and a lot of times the British government would send naturalists along just to enjoy the ride and do some research to kind of like get a little bit more bang for their buck. So you can see how they started off in England and spent a lot of time in South America. And all around South America, he's collecting lots of specimens, lots of birds, lots of everything, fossils. He witnessed some interesting geologic events, basically some earthquakes and some volcanoes, which you never see in England. And this kind of made him realize that the world was changing. Physically, the world is changing. He's finding fossils of animals that aren't around anymore, so obviously animals are changing too. One of the more famous stops that Darwin made was the Galapagos Islands. And here he collected lots and lots of different birds on all the different islands, and he brought them all back to England and had his ornithologist, someone who studies birds, looked at them, and he was kind of surprised to find out that they were all finches. And this helped him see that there was a lot of variation in organisms. There's a lot of different variety. You can kind of see over here, these are all the different types of finches that he found on different islands. And you can see, like, for example, this guy obviously is very, very different from these guys over here. And so while Darwin thought they were all very, very different birds, it turns out they were all finches. And he spent a lot of time on this. You know, he realized that organisms were changing, and he also realized that this wasn't going to be a really, really popular idea. And so he spent a lot of time gathering evidence for this. He would do little experiments to see if, he like bred pigeons. And you know how you can make dogs into different breeds. You can kind of do that with pigeons. So you can see through artificial selection how you can change one pigeon and create lots of different ones. He just did tons and tons of experiments trying to gather evidence. And then where he intersects with Wallace here is Wallace started doing his work and goes to Malaysia, which is in this area over here. And like I said, he basically has the same idea that natural selection, that the best species, the things that survive the best, do the best. And he actually knew Darwin and was writing him letters, and he sent Darwin a draft of his paper, and Darwin was like, oh crap, this person is, he's a kind of an upstart new geologist or biologist, and he's going to scoop me. He's going to get all my credit, even though he'd been working on it for a long, long time. And so basically he threw something together really quickly, and the two of them presented their findings at the same meeting, the same scientific meeting, pretty much the exact same time. But then the difference is that Darwin went on to publish his book on the origin of species in 1859, in which he explained evolution through natural selection. And this was actually a very, very popular book. It sold out almost instantaneously, had a couple more printings, and so it became very, very popular. So he popularized the theory. And you can see, 1859 is when he published that book, and he gets back from his trip around the world in 1836. All that time in between was him gathering evidence and support. So, some people say it was kind of underhanded for him to publish and sneak in and publish at the same time as Wallace, but really, he did come to the idea first, and he was spending a lot of time trying to gather evidence and sort of perfect his idea. So that's why he gets the credit. So with that, we're done, and next time we'll talk about natural selection.